So like everyone on Twitter, on YouTube, on the internet these days, I wanted a personal assistant that is always on my desk and just like available for me to look at while it's working. And that is Openclaw. And if you're not familiar, Openclaw is an autonomous AI assistant that has taken the internet by storm. And by the way, it was recently sold to OpenAI. So Openclaw is now part of the OpenAI, ecosystem, if you will. And all of that being said, I wanted my personal version of my AI assistant on the Raspberry Pi. So in this video, I'll be showing you how I set up Openclaw on my Raspberry Pi. Now, if you've been looking into hosting your own personal Openclaw instance, your own AI agents, there are a few options, right? Ranging from hardware like the Mac Mini. I do have a Mac Mini here, and all the way to VPSs and just, a bunch of interesting choices. There is also one that exists, and that is the one I'm going with, and that will be setting up an Openclaw instance on the Raspberry Pi. Of course, the Mac Mini would give you really great performance. Your VPS is going to be much less expensive than the Mac Mini, and also perhaps less expensive than the Raspberry Pi. More on the pricing maybe in another video. But if I'm gonna be honest, this whole Openclaw hype, debacle, whatever you want to call it, was the perfect excuse to get the Raspberry Pi. And I jumped on that instantly. So I have the Raspberry Pi 16 gig running Ubuntu, and I'll be walking you through the process of how I got Openclaw setting up on this thing. Now, I had a few hiccups, I had a few bottlenecks, there were a few things I had to deal with, but it wasn't anything too crazy. TLDR is a very straightforward process. So if you don't want to sit through the entire thing, it works really, really well. A lot better than a lot of folks told me it would, honestly. And yeah, that leads me to the second point of a stress test. I will be making a full, in-depth, very detailed stress test on the Raspberry Pi. So basically getting Openclaw to push this thing to its limit to see what you can actually get out of this really tiny piece of hardware. So first things first, I have the Raspberry Pi in its case. Nothing too fancy. This is the 16 gig RAM version of the Raspberry Pi. And then the next thing I did was to download the Raspberry Pi imager. This is how you flash the operating system on top of the Raspberry Pi. If you're new to this, it is really, really simple. All you have to do is download the Raspberry Pi imager, select the operating system you'd like to install, and then you flash that into your SD card. Now ensure that you have the SD card installed and connected to your computer. So when I spun up the Raspberry Pi imager, my initial operating system of choice was the Raspberry Pi OS. I thought it was going to be lightweight, it was built for the Raspberry Pi. So it sort of made sense to try that out. So I flashed that on my SD card. I put the SD card on the Raspberry Pi and I booted that up. Played around with it for a little bit, and yeah, I wasn't a fan of the Raspberry Pi OS. It just wasn't working for me. And so I did what any rational human being was going to do. I took the SD card out of the Raspberry Pi, took it back into my weird ass janky looking adapter, connected it to the Mac Mini, and then this time I flashed Ubuntu on it. And I'm very familiar with Ubuntu, very comfortable with the operating system. And so, it just made sense to pivot to that. Waited a couple minutes for the installation to be complete, and I put that back into the Raspberry Pi and we're off to the races. So I ran this command to install Openclaw and everything was pretty straightforward. When the installation process begins, it'll ask you a bunch of questions. Again, I think the setup process is very intuitive. You really can't go wrong. Just ensure you have your API key handy. Could be from OpenRouter, Anthropic. I personally started off with OpenRouter and then I pivoted to using Kimi K2.5 from Moonshot. And that just works really well for me. And so that has been my daily driver model of choice for the past couple of days. So once you set up your API of choice, it'll spin up the TUI and you can begin to actively converse with your agent. Now that already lives locally on the Raspberry Pi or on your VPS or whatever machine that exists. To take it a step further, you would need to set this up on Telegram or Discord or Slack or whichever messaging platform of choice. I recommend that you start off with Telegram. It is really intuitive. It is really straightforward. I started off with Telegram, but I currently have moved to Discord, and oh my goodness, Discord is so much better. But I recommend you start with Telegram if this is your first time getting into this. It just sort of makes sense for you. And then as you get comfortable working with Openclaw and understanding how it works, you can then pivot to, say, Discord or Slack. And it's a lot more robust. You can do so many cool things. You can create channels for different contexts. If you're working on a piece of content, if you're working on a specific piece of content, you could have a specific channel for that. On Telegram, you just have the whole thing in one fell swoop. And perhaps there are a lot of people who do it differently, but Discord works really well for me, and that's just all I have to say about it. So once you set it up on Telegram, you can text it from your phone, from your laptop, from your iPad, from any machine, anywhere in the world, and it'll work really well, effortlessly. So I did have some latency issues on the Raspberry Pi because I'm hosting it locally and it's having to ping servers from the UK well, servers mostly in Europe and the US, and that takes a bit of time. So it's just something I have to deal with. But it's been working really well so far. And yeah, that is pretty much it. This is the Raspberry Pi 5, 16 gigs. It handles Openclaw really, really well. I'm working on a stress test video that will come out pretty soon. It puts this through its paces, and we sort of get a feel of what this machine can do and how many sub agents you can run. What is the threshold for something as portable as this relative to, you know, a $500, $600, $700, $1,000 Mac Mini or computer or whatever. And yeah, look forward to that. If you're interested in that, leave a like, subscribe, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one. So that is the full setup from zero to a fully functional working AI assistant on the Raspberry Pi. So this is the case. This is how it sits on my desk. Well, not my desk actually, but like a desk. And honestly, the hardest part was really picking the operating system. I tried the Pi OS like I showed you, and then I just settled with Ubuntu because I'm very familiar with Ubuntu and it just made sense to me. And so far, so good. It works really, really well. I'll be sure to put all of the links in the description, the repository, the Raspberry Pi kit, and everything else you might need. Now, if you do want to see the full stress test, I'll be releasing that video very, very soon. So be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. Also turn on notifications if you haven't done any of those things already. And yeah, thanks again. I'll be seeing you in the next one.